I recently published a video showing off the secrets found at the bottom of the ocean outside Boston. That video was such a success that I went on and did a video about similar secrets found at the bottom of the ocean around the island near Far Harbor. But now I'm running out of bodies of water to explore. So naturally, next on the list, we are going to the glowing sea. But don't let the name fool you, this isn't a sea. And unlike my previous videos, we won't have to do funny things with depth of field to remove the underwater effect. That's because the glowing sea is no sea at all. Found in the southwesternmost corner of the map, the glowing sea is the impact site for one of the largest nuclear bombs that the Chinese dropped on the Boston area during the Great War. Instead of swimming through a sea of salt water, we will be wading through a sea of radiation. To start this adventure, we will walk south along the road from Natick Banks. Here, the road dissolves before us and turns into a tree-strewn, rubble-filled, sunken, irradiated wasteland. The glowing sea takes up a roughly circular spot on the map, so we're going to try and cover every inch of the thing by zigzagging across it. We're going to first go west towards the abandoned shack. Once we hit there, we're going to go east towards a hidden cave, then we're going to zigzag back to explore a capsized factory, and so on until we explore the entire thing and end at the crater of Atom. Now, unlike my video on the ocean floor, the glowing sea is filled with enemies. In particular, we will fight a number of deathclaws and scorpions, some of the toughest enemies in the entire game. The dead skull scorpions in particular are really tough for me, even though I'm wearing power armor. You'll watch me just sit here with my Gatling laser pointed at the thing, and the scorpion's armor causes the lasers to just bounce off. Once we reach the glowing sea, the weather changes. It goes from a nice clear day with blue skies to an irradiated day with a sickly green haze. Now, I could have used console commands to remove this, but I think the sickliness of it, the greenishness of it, is so characteristic of the glowing sea that I would be misrepresenting the place if I removed it, and I think we will get enough detail, so I left it in. Now, one of the things I want to talk about while exploring the glowing sea is more than just the human relics we find, but also the geology. How was the glowing sea formed? That topic has always interested me. I talked a little bit about it when I did my video on the Atlantic offices, but I want to go into greater detail here. As we walk around, we see this cracked mud on the ground. This, of course, is reminiscent of a dried lake bed. You go to Nevada, you go to California, you can sometimes find these huge salt flats. These were ancient lake beds that have dried up, condensing the salt into thin layers on top of the seabed, but underneath you find this cracked mud. And yet here in the glowing sea, the cracked mud is often right near to still wet pools and puddles, which of course makes sense because there's a lot of weather here. It's not a desert. We see lightning strikes going off in the distance and thick clouds converging above us. Todd Howard, in 2015, while he was at E3, described the glowing sea and said that the rad storms in the wastes are actually born from the glowing sea. What happens is rain clouds will sail over the glowing sea, and as they travel over, will pick up a lot of the radiation emanating from the crater, bring it with them across Boston, and rain it down on the other areas. The reason we have rad storms in Boston is because of the glowing sea. The radiation emanating from the dried mud is so strong that it's absorbed and picked up by passing rain clouds. But one of the reasons I think the glowing sea is still so toxic today, 200 years after the bomb has dropped, whereas other places in Boston have more or less recovered, is because the glowing sea is in a really shallow part of Boston. As we get closer, we see this big hedge of stones start to encircle us. Part of this is game design. They don't want you to wander on off, so they've got this big wall of rock to serve as the edge of the world. But there are other places, particularly in the southeastern part of Boston, where they just put an invisible invisible wall in your way, so the big rocky walls aren't necessarily needed for game design. Instead, they're telling us that this part of the Commonwealth is possibly below sea level. If we go east towards Vault 95, we see that the vault is built into a rocky hillside that separates the rest of the Commonwealth from the glowing sea. Coming south from Natick Banks, you watched, we went over a small ridge and now we're going down into a basin. So what I think is happening here is this place was hit with a huge bomb. The soil soaked up all of this radiation, and as weather comes in and out of this area, instead of washing all of this toxic waste, instead of washing all of the radioactive material out to the sea, the rain will make pools and then the sun will dry it away. And the rain will make more pools and the sun will dry it away. And like layers of salt appear on dry lake beds that were once filled with salty water, layers of toxic waste and radioactive material stacks and stacks and stacks and builds up in the glowing sea, making it more irradiated and more hazardous to your health. I think the unique topology of this area is one of the reasons that it's still so highly irradiated 200 years after the bombs dropped, even though in real life, people have moved back into areas that were once bombed by nuclear weapons, and even in the Fallout world, at least in Fallout 4, there are still places in the Commonwealth that are more or less free from radiation. Speaking about unique topology, while exploring the glowing sea, we find some buildings that appear where they should be, like shacks sitting on top of the earth, and other buildings that appear to be sunken. There's even a factory here called the Capsized Factory. We'll find buses and cars that are submerged, not beneath water, but beneath mud and toxic waste. We'll even find human bones embedded in the soil. I think what likely explains this is the natural phenomenon of liquefaction. This typically happens during earthquakes. I talked a little bit about this during my video on the Atlantic offices, and there was a great discussion on that video page. A lot of people who were really smart and knew a lot about geology came and provided me with links to articles and topics, and I learned a lot about liquefaction. And when something dramatic happens, like a huge earthquake that makes the soil unstable, the earth unreliable, or possibly a huge nuclear detonation, the earth can act like a liquid instead of a solid. Things that were buried under the ground like sewer pipes can suddenly stick up, and giant factories or buildings that are just built on the soil and not attached to bedrock can sink down beneath the earth. I think this liquefaction can help explain why we find so many buried and half-buried structures and people and cars. Additionally, the impact of the initial bomb was so great that it probably scattered a lot of material all over the glowing sea. The blast itself is clearly responsible for annihilating entire towns and villages. We find buildings with only a single wall standing, everything else has crumbled, but the blast also moved a lot of earth, which covered buildings or entire churches, for example. We'll find some of those in a moment. It reminds me of pyroclastic flows. Now, I live in Washington State, so when I was in school, I learned a lot about the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and as a child, they would show me video footage of the entire side of the mountain just collapsing and falling down to earth. This was a pyroclastic flow. The eruption of Mount St. Helens was so severe that the rock just detached from the side of the mountain, and a huge avalanche of dirt and lava and rock slid down the side of the mountain, covering a huge area of land, destroying everything in its path. I think some of the material ejected by this nuclear blast may have acted a lot like a pyroclastic flow. Hot, irradiated, molten rock, ash, and dirt flowing across this area, covering people, cars, houses, and buildings, and then burning people to death, causing them to suffocate. And there were a lot of people here because this area, the glowing sea, this wasn't a huge industrial spot. This wasn't a big military base, although there were military targets here. This was a residential area. We do find military targets, we do find some factories, but what we find more than anything are playgrounds and ramblers and neighborhoods. In the Fallout world, this area of Boston must not have been subject to zoning regulations that would have moved factories and military bases of operation into different sectors. In this part of the glowing sea, we find houses and commercial buildings and industrial buildings all jumbled up together in a big area. We'll find an abandoned shack that was built specifically to blend into this suburban-looking place. This place got hit because there was a lot of military activity going on here. We'll find a sentinel site, which was the home of many nuclear warheads, and we'll find a military surveillance bunker. So there was definitely a reason for the Chinese to attack, but amongst all of those military targets, we find a suburban area, white picket fences, cars, and a lot of playgrounds. While exploring the glowing sea, we are walking atop the grave of countless human beings who died during this blast, many of which were children. Now, we've been exploring the Federal Supply Cache 84NE. This is one of the first bunkers we come upon when traveling south into the glowing sea from Natick Banks. When you arrive, everything is quiet, but there's a circuit breaker inside that you can flip, which turns on the security defenses here. 2 protectrons will come on out, and then you'll have to either hack them or destroy them. And then going back outside, the laser turrets on top of the building will attack. We don't find any lore here, but there are beds and plenty of buff out and chems to loot. You can access a terminal, which will unlock the supply cache, where we find some chems and ammunition. Walking west of this point, we come upon one of the first playgrounds, giving us another indication that this might have been a park or someone's backyard. We see the ruins of residential houses nearby. But walking west of here, we reach the abandoned shack. This shack is actually a front. Beneath this shack is a sprawling surveillance bunker where the Americans would intercept and spy upon Chinese transmissions. After exploring the bunker, an elevator will appear behind it. This isn't there when you first find the shack. It only appears after you explore it. This surveillance bunker was camouflaged to look like just a regular house in this suburban neighborhood, but underneath you have an extremely sophisticated American surveillance program. I explored this entire bunker in a video I made dedicated to the abandoned shack, so I won't do so here, but inside you can find a full suit of leveled power armor and the U.S. Covert Operations Manual, which will improve your stealth. It was here I started to feel bad for Kate. She didn't have her helmet on, and here she is in an irradiated wasteland, so I went ahead and put her helmet back on. So, we've zigged, it's time to zag. Walking east across this devastation, we come upon scorpion after scorpion. These death skull scorpions are really tricky. We come to another ruins. One building is left in better condition than most, but still half of it is gone. Inside, we find some right-away and buff out, sitting on top of some crates that are magically not sliding down this floor, and also another wooden crate filled with loot. Continuing west, we come upon a playground. This playground has a spaceship slide, monkey bars, a couple of swing sets, and a jungle gym. There are cars parked nearby and a fence going around it. This must have been a neighborhood park for the families to come and let their kids play. It was right next to a road, though. This is a collapsed overpass that went north through Natick Banks. This is the road that disappeared as we tried to follow it south into the glowing sea. We're now exploring a huge rubble pile of twisted metal from destroyed buildings and concrete from this fallen overpass. Here we find an unmarked location. This is a Red Rocket truck stop with an interior cell. Like many of the buildings here, it is partially sunken into the floor. Going inside, we find a beautiful interior cell. I think I talked about this area when I did my video on the relay tower that we find here in the glowing sea. You can go into the garage and activate a button to raise the garage door. Inside we find a van with a wooden crate, but as you can see, we can't get out. It's impacted with rubble. There is one half-hanging fluorescent light. It casts beautiful shadows, and light plays on the water in here. It's a beautiful place. Inside we find one master-locked safe, and that's really about it. Heading out from here, though, we find a cave. This is one of 2 caves, crafted from twisting metal that came off of nearby houses, and molten mud and rock from the pyroclastic flows that we find here in the glowing sea. It's just an interesting geological feature. There's no real good loot in here. Continuing east, we can go back to the interstate. Here we find a Deathclaw waiting for us. They really like these roads for some reason. After it's dead, we can climb to the top of it to see that there was a truck carrying cargo containers. And inside we find a whole bunch of safes. These safes still have loot in them, which is funny. I mean, you would think that if this was a company paying this driver to transfer these safes to businesses that purchase them, the safes wouldn't already have loot inside of them. I suppose maybe a company was moving. Maybe the military was moving to a new office, and so they packed up a bunch of safes that already had loot inside of them to take them to the new offices. But some of these are already broken, the doors having fallen off, the contents looted long ago by scavengers. This is a high point in the glowing sea. We can hop up on top of these shipping containers to see a great view of the nearby wastes. Even though the sun is setting and we're in the middle of the glowing sea, we can still kind of see the tops of some of the skyscrapers off in the distance. I took this opportunity to wait until daybreak. I wanted to make sure to explore in the best light possible. Here I started to turn south. We find a lot of rad roaches clinging to the wall of a nearby building. And that's the theme here: scorpions, death claws, and lots of bugs. Not a whole lot of mammals, although we do find mole rats. Zigging west, we find the ruins of some sort of factory. Giant pipes stick out of the ground, and it looks like a nearby billboard has fallen on top. I was just about to explore when I got distracted by a beautiful sight off in the distance. A death claw, but it's pure white. It almost looked like it was glowing. Far more white than the albino death claws we are used to. As I approached, I realized it was a chameleon death claws. These bad boys change colors as you fight them. And even after they die, their corpses will change colors too. So it looks like the Jackson chameleon has not completely lost its ability to change colors. The evolved trait must still exist somewhere in the genes of these deathclaws. Back to the capsized factory, we can enter by going through a hole in what was once the roof. This portion of the factory has long since sunken beneath the mud. Here at the top of the stairs, we find a lot of chems and luckily some Radaway and Rad-X. It's convenient that pre-war people set out a bunch of this radiation protecting chems, almost as if they knew this place was going to be highly irradiated someday. Heading through a door, we arrive at the top of a catwalk where we see a slew of feral ghouls wandering the factory floor. They race up the catwalk to attack. Pain Train is a whole lot of fun to use against these feral ghouls. In one of the pods on the factory floor, we find more Radaway conveniently placed here, and then a big, advanced locked safe. Exploring further awakens even more of these ghouls. The creatures here are so high level that I walked away with a whole lot of legendary weapons. Both Kate's inventory and mine were filled to the brim with legendary weapons. On the opposite end of this factory floor, we can go through a doorway labeled Exit, and then a bloated glowing one crawls down from the ceiling to attack. We can go out the exit. This normally would have led right outside, but as you can see, the entire exit is blocked with twisted metal. We can go back up the stairs and across the catwalk to exit through a big hole in the concrete wall. This leads us back to where we were. Continuing west, we approach the Atlantic offices. Nearby is an interesting scene. We find a bus that is completely sunken in this mud. More evidence of liquefaction. And the bones of the people who were riding this bus have risen to the top of this mud. Bones are scattered all around this area just outside the bus stop, pouring out of this bus and flowing down the hill. The nearby bus stop is also completely sunken, with only the monitor sticking out. Up the hill, we reach the Atlantic offices, an interesting location, but I did an entire video dedicated to this place and the cut content that was supposed to be here, so I won't get into too much detail here. I encourage you to check out that video. Inside, we just find a whole bunch of ghouls. Heading northwest of here, we kill a lot of bugs and shoot a lot of scorpions to climb a steep hillside until we reach a small valley. Here at the bottom of the valley is the forgotten church, completely buried. Nearby, we find the broken bell tower or clock tower. It's beautiful but completely destroyed. To enter, we can peer through a gap. I didn't see any feral ghouls or enemies in there, so I just jumped on down. In the corner of this forgotten church is a steamer trunk filled with loot, and that's it. It's beautiful, but it's tiny. I think there may be a scripted event where once you loot this chest, a chameleon deathclaw appears, because as soon as I did, Kate, who was still topside, got attacked by one. So I raced over to the fallen tree, walked across it to jump up and see her under attack. It was a legendary chameleon deathclaw, probably one of my favorite enemies in the game. It's here that we bump up against the edge of the world. We can't go any more west, so turning south, we bypass the ruins of even more residential buildings to find another interesting geologic feature. Do you see this warping sensation? It's almost as if there's something hot directly beneath the surface. I thought maybe it was coming from this tree. Looks like waves of heat distorting the light. But walking a little further south, I found another spot. It's not just the trees, but this area, possibly the cracked earth, is emitting this heat or a fume of some sort that is distorting visible light. Heading west, we reach two big dome-looking things with pipes sticking out of them. time, a chameleon deathclaw was hiding in one of these big bulbs, and as we get closer, we learn that this is the decayed reactor site. The Deathclaw ran, and so I chased, but as soon as I killed him, I got attacked by 3 more scorpions. Oh my gosh, they just come from nowhere. Going back to explore the reactor, there's a little bit of a bunker right next to the ruins. Inside the bunker, it's just a huge disaster. There's not a whole lot. Behind an open security gate, we find a few nuclear reactors with the corpse of a soldier inside. And inside we find a switch, but flipping the circuit breaker doesn't really do much. A siren goes off, lights outside start to blare, and then it just stops. Not sure why. These big domes are fascinating to me. They're so majestic and thematic, but I didn't really know enough about nuclear technology to understand what these were, so I did a little bit of research. And it looks like these big domes were containment buildings for a nuclear reactor. In particular, these giant bulbs look a lot like the 2 containment domes at the Diablo Canyon power plant in California. And these domes contained the reactor. The uranium fuel was stored inside a reactor vessel inside these domes, and then the reactor was cooled with a reactor coolant, usually water, typically from some sort of groundwater. Now, there are many types of ways to cool a reactor. What I think this one would have been a pressurized water cooler. Inside the dome, you would have the reactor core with the uranium and the rods and all of that, but then you would have a big tank filled with the coolant. This water then gets vaporized by the active fission in the reactor, and then the steam would go and power a steam generator, which would then provide electricity to the surrounding area. This decayed reactor site must have been a pressurized water reactor, providing electricity to this community. We don't find much else here other than the corpse of a child of Adam. Heading west to continue along our zigzag, we come to a flat plain with some shallow pools inside. And it's here that we typically find a lot of feral ghouls. This site in particular, I got swarmed by a whole bunch of them. There are quite a few shallow pools like this swarming with feral ghouls in the glowing sea. This is more evidence, I think, of the inability of the glowing sea to actually drain away any of the water that lands here, which is why the pools that have accumulated here are filled with such radioactive toxic material. Nearby are the ruins of more residential buildings. One is partially intact. We can climb into the rooftop of one, where we find a wooden crate with some ammunition, a first aid kit, and a toolbox. Continuing west, we stumble upon a super duper mart. This is an unmarked location. The mart itself is completely covered with no entrance to be seen, but the nearby parking garage does have one door, still above the ground. Upon entering, Kate has something to say.
Wait a damn second. Where'd all the ferals go?
Well, she is right. There are not a whole lot of ferals. We find a few feral corpses outside. Heading into a nearby wrecked bus, we see that it leads down to the floor below, but let's finish exploring this floor before we go any further. In one corner of the building, we find 2 feral ghouls sleeping on the ground. After killing them, we see that this was their campsite. These people must have come here, seeking shelter after the bombs dropped, only the radiation turned them into feral ghouls. They were surviving on treats they found in the supermarket. We find stacks of Dandy Boy apples on top of cinder blocks and crates. There's a nearby security gate that we can unlock. Doing so, we can loot a first aid kit, a toolbox, and a wooden crate. If we try to go up the ramp, we see that it's completely blocked in by cars. This gives us only one direction left to go, and that's to drop down into this flooded bottom floor. Here we don't see any ghouls. Kate was right. No ghouls to be seen. I wonder why, and then we learn why. In the corner, an alpha deathclaw with its horns turned up like a demon emerges from the water and attacks. Behind one wall, near a blocked-off elevator exit, we find a steamer trunk filled with end-of-dungeon loot. On the wall next to this is an advertisement for the Giddy Up Buttercup. Every girl's fantasy, now a reality. Only $16,000? Oh my god. That Fallout inflation, man, gets you every time. We can find a working elevator in the corner over here, thankfully. Taking this elevator, we see that the horrible elevator music is still intact after 200 years. The elevator lets us out to the top floor parking of the parking garage, which in the air 2287 is the ground floor of the glowing sea. It's time to zag west. Doing so, we encounter and dispose of more of the glowing sea fauna until we see the steeple of another church sticking out of the mud. As we get close, we see feral ghouls walking around on one of the top floors. Heading up top, we can peer inside to see ghouls all over the floor. I decided to jump down and ignite the oil. Holy cow, it's a whole lot of ghouls here, and they are fun to kill with a Gatling laser. Now this is one of the locations that you get sent to by exploring the nearby relay tower. It comes with an interesting minor side story. I'm not going to spoil it here. If you're interested, you can watch my video on the nearby relay tower, which you can watch here to find that full story. Back outside and going east, we find another overpass going into downtown Boston. Following this one takes us to the edge of the glowing sea. There's no building here, just a big broken overpass, but it does mark the point where the glowing sea ends and the Commonwealth begins. Heading south of here, we can go to Waypoint Echo. Won't exist in every game. This is a Brotherhood of Steel installation. Also near this point is Vault 95, built into the side of the mountain range, separating the rest of the Commonwealth from the giant basin, which allowed for the formation of the glowing sea. South of here is Relay Tower 0DB521. This is the video I just showed you a moment ago. Raising the dishes on this relay tower opens up 3 new radio broadcasts on your Pip-Boy, taking you to 3 interesting places here in the glowing sea. Going west again, we find a vertibird wreckage site. I'm not sure why this exists. We see vertibird crashing all the time. Why did Bethesda decide to make a vertibird wreck a marked location in the glowing sea? Maybe to make fast travel easier, I suppose? Southwest of here, walking over a whole bunch of rubble, we find another cave. This cave is one of the destinations you're sent to when you activate the relay signals. Inside, you'll find a raider corpse using this ham radio and a full suit of raider power armor, but I have long since looted both. Heading west, we find a whole bunch of mole rats, only to go over a hill to find a whole bunch more ghouls waiting around in this toxic, goopy water. At length, we arrive at the O'Neill Family Manufacturing. Now, the door to this is a security door, so it's closed and we don't have access to opening it. However, we can drop down a hole in a nearby buried roof to enter the facility. Down a catwalk, we can find a pod with a first aid kit in it, and round a corner to be attacked by one charred feral ghoul. Looks like there's only one member of the O'Neill family left. Here we find a power armor repair station, a big box of ammunition, and one of the few boxed robot model kits. This is the SentryBot model kit with the unique robot model box. These boxes disappear once you loot the kit and put it together. It is a gorgeous little box, though. Nearby, we find a terminal which allows us to open the door that we saw on the roof and access some of the terminal entries here. Here we learned that the O'Neill Family Manufacturing was actually a robot repair place. William Thomas came by with a busted Mr. Handy. Thomas kept saying that the Mr. Handy always falls over to the ground 4 or 5 times a day. He said that the neighborhood kids would throw baseballs at it, but initially the technicians here couldn't find anything wrong with the robot. But after spending 16 hours looking at it, they discovered that the robot had a screw loose. Yes, a literal screw loose. Evidently, the screw was bouncing around inside the robot, bumping up against a propulsion fail switch inside the robot. That's what was causing the robot to fall to the ground, so they just screwed the screws back in place. Next was for a customer named Jared Bean. The problem with this Mr. Handy is it was constantly bumping into things in the house. They spent 8 hours diagnosing the problem, and they discovered that one of the optical sensors had been wired incorrectly. This was a heavily modified robot, and it tells us a little bit about the robot scene pre-war. Looks like people were buying robots from General Atomics and Robco and modifying them, just like people modify cars and games to their heart's content in our own world. The final customer is Jessica McCann. She brought in a Protectron after coworkers started to say that they were smelling some mildew coming from the bot. The technicians asked what could have possibly been going on, and Jessica sheepishly replied that the bot might have been involved in a company happy hour pool party that went on last week. So they fixed the issue by draining the lower compartment, which was completely filled with water, cleaning it, rinsing it, and drying it. Well, now that the door is unlocked, we can head on upstairs. I'm sure in here we'll find a bunch of wonderful loot. Oh no, it's a bunch of feral ghouls! Here I said there was only one member of the O'Neill family left. Now it looks like the entire O'Neill family got stuck up here in this room. But it looks like there were a bunch of other employees that died here as well. Inside the bins, we find entire human skeletons. Remember, not everyone is genetically predisposed to becoming a ghoul when exposed to radiation. Some people just die like they normally would in the real world. Looks like that's what happened here. After looting the red steamer trunk, we can head on out. I explored one of the big broken pipes nearby, not expecting to find anything. I inspected a bunch during this video, and all of them were empty, but this one wasn't. Inside, we find 2 skeletons and a first aid kit. As we get close to a wrecked airplane, we'll often see a wandering iBot. This one isn't spewing Enclave propaganda like in Fallout 3, and you don't have to repair it like in Fallout New Vegas. I don't know the story to this little guy, he's just spewing static. But you can hack him to turn him into a temporary companion. I don't really need his help, but if I can feel like I've got Ed E watching my back even for a moment here in Fallout 4, I'm gonna take the opportunity. Heading west of this point, we come to the crash site of the Skylanes Flight 1665. This is the final destination that you go to after activating the relay tower. I covered it in that video. The light that you see blinking on the tail only blinks once you turn it on after finding the switch inside the plane, so watch that video to find out that location. Heading west, we go down into a large residential ruins area. There are some mole rats here. Nearby, we find a few leaning buildings which are interesting. One looks like a leaning water tower. I'm not sure what this is exactly. It's right next to some interesting machinery. After killing some blood bugs nearby, we can explore this machine. Looks like a grain harvester of some sort. So this tells us if a grain harvester was here, then this couldn't have been an exclusively residential area. Maybe there were small farms nearby. Then again, we are going a little bit west of the residential portion of the glowing sea. Maybe south of Boston, they had some grain farms. Would explain why this portion seems to be a little flatter and devoid of trees. There's another big tipping structure. It looks like a bunch of canisters of some sort. Maybe they held fuel, or maybe they were for water. They could be a whole bunch of conjoined water towers, not sure. Now, if we walk too far west from this point, we start to see more trees. This is the invisible line that separates the glowing sea from the swamps. Just south of Boston, you know, where we find Gunner's Plaza and the Merkwater construction site, that area. The sky will clear up when we get towards this area, but we're still within sight of the glowing sea. If we're quick, we can run back the way we came, and for a brief moment, enjoy some of the sights of the glowing sea without that thick, green, moody haze that we typically see. This is the same time of day. I haven't altered the time of day with any console commands for this shot, and yet we can see very clearly and very far. The Skylanes flight, the water and relay towers off in the distance, and even downtown Boston. I just so happened to discover a Deathclaw cave right beneath this rock I was standing on top of. Another beautiful chameleon Deathclaw. But By the time I finished off this Deathclaw, the haze had returned. The game will recalculate weather as you walk pretty quickly, I don't know the numbers. But oh no, I lost an arm. This doggone Deathclaw just knocked off one of my arms. But I remember there was a power armor station inside the O'Neill family manufacturing building. So heading back there, going down to the basement, I can hop on out of my power armor. Thankfully, I have managed to pick up enough scrap during this trip to repair my arm. Once fully repaired, I used the opportunity to wait until daybreak, and then I traveled back south to continue where I left off. Heading west from this southernmost section, we see concrete obelisks sticking up out of the dirt. 5 of them, one with a catwalk around it, and 4 others with big vents sticking out. Near to these obelisks is the Sentinel site, a pyramid sticking out of the soil.
I've never seen anything like that before.
Indeed, Kate has never seen anything like this before. She's never seen photos of the pyramids, most likely. I did a video dedicated to the Sentinel site, and it's probably one of the most satisfying videos that I ever did, because I got to do some research on really interesting structures built by the United States in the real world. This building is based off of a real building, and I showed off pictures and talked all about the history of that building in the video that I made on this topic. Those big obelisks that we passed are actually exhaust towers. The real world version of this building had a big missile silo. The silos were buried in the ground, and when you launched a missile, the explosions of those missile launches were funneled through those exhaust towers up into the sky. That was their purpose. But in this game, Bethesda decided to turn the pyramid itself into the missile silo. We find 4 holes on the tippy top of the pyramid. Those were the silos that the missiles were supposed to come out of. An unrealistic design. The real one wasn't like that, but it is fascinating. We still find the nuclear warheads that the Brotherhood of Steel came here for, scattered in the mud just outside the door to the Sentinel site, which is strange. I am exploring this again on my Brotherhood character, and having defeated the Institute with the Brotherhood, it's strange that the Brotherhood left these bombs just sitting outside the Sentinel site. When doing research for my video on the Sentinel site, I discovered that the original building that inspired this Sentinel site structure was retired for military use and then sold to the public at an auction. Some fellow out there paid $1 million or so for this thing and is now using it as his private home. And I think that that is such a cool thought. If I was ever the kind of guy to slink away from public life and just become a hermit somewhere, I would totally do so in an abandoned nuclear pyramid. Someday. We are now walking along the invisible world boundary on the southernmost portion of the glowing sea. Continuing west to finish exploring, we have to start climbing a really steep hill that makes up the mountain range that creates this basin that the glowing sea is inside. Here we kill more scorpions, and I finally come upon an albino Deathclaw. It's such a cool looking creature, but it just seems like it looks different from the chameleon Deathclaws. From a distance, the chameleon Deathclaws are almost a glowing, iridescent white color. These albino Deathclaws are more like a peachy white. Bleached on the outside, but the nooks and crannies and crevices are almost a pinkish color. Still, they look amazing. After climbing the mountainside, we come to another plain. All of this cracked mud and little pools of highly irradiated water. We go southwest of this point to find a path leading to Virgil's cave. This was guarded by a chameleon Deathclaw, and notice that it is a more papery white when we get close, but then of course it changes color, the chameleon Deathclaw that it is.
We've got to do this more often.
Heading onto the cave, we can see our good friend Virgil. He still has his machine gun turrets outside and his robots, but getting close, he wants nothing to do with us.
I think you should leave. I don't want visitors. Just please, leave me alone.
And that's of course because we destroyed the Institute. You know, the Brotherhood of Steel sent me here to kill Virgil. They didn't really care that he had cured himself of being a super mutant. The quest is called Unfinished Business, and even after you destroy the Institute, even though Virgil helped you to destroy the Institute, even though Virgil is completely peaceful, Lieutenant Kells sends you to murder him just because he's a super mutant. Very different from the Mojave chapter of the Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout New Vegas, where Elder McNamara is willing to let nearby peaceful super mutants be because he respects them, because they're peaceful, only turning on them when they become violent. The same Brotherhood of Steel, two very different visions. In this game, I sided with the Brotherhood of Steel. In this game, I completely destroyed Acadia, but I spared Virgil's life because I rationalized it in my head. He may have been a super mutant, but he found a cure, and he is no longer a super mutant now, so I convinced Captain Kells not to kill him. North of Virgil's cave, we come upon a decrepit factory. This factory is so decrepit and smashed to bits that there's no portion we can even enter. Only a few little pods are floating above the mud here and there. In one of the pods, we find a bunch of circuitry lying out and some Radex, the skeleton of a man next to some circuitry. And in the middle of the pool, we see a skeletonized hand sticking out of the sinking pod. And getting close, indeed, that is exactly what this is. An entire skeleton is trying to claw its way out of this sinking pod. Is this a reference to Terminator 2? I guess he'd be having to make a thumbs up sign for it to be a reference to Terminator 2. But it's an eerie sight nonetheless. This poor man reaching out for help as his lungs are filled with boiling irradiated water. Heading north of here, at last, we reach Ground Zero. The impact site, the place where the biggest bomb dropped on Boston landed, the crater of Adam. Of course, the children of Adam have turned this into a holy site, and as we approach, we can hear them praying.
We must suffer to truly feel Adam's embrace, to lay broken before him, and feel the gentle wash of the glow. The faithless must be punished. Adam's chosen must bring judgment to his enemies. May the glow of Adam guide your path. In the end, we are all Adam's children.
Looks like some of the faithful couldn't survive the radiation here. We do find entire skeletons lying around. Brother Ogden here is a merchant.
All those seeking Adam are welcome. Or is it something more tangible you require?
What have you got for sale?
Whatever Adam provides for us. It is not much, true, but you may find something of value.
He doesn't have a really amazing inventory. At higher levels, he's got some good explosives, but that's about it. We can explore each of these little shacks. There's not a whole lot here.
I will count the bodies of the heretics I have burned, and for each one, I bring a smile on the lips of Adam.
Good grief, Ward. That's a little dark. It's here in this camp that we'll find another copy of the astoundingly awesome tales, and we can go up and talk with Mother Isolde. Even though I've already beaten the game and gotten from her the dialogue I needed to do so, after meeting and befriending the children of Adam in Far Harbor, she has unique dialogue.
How have you survived out here?
Our faith in Adam is unwavering. In return, he has granted us his blessing and protects us from those who would do us harm. None without his favor could survive in such a place, but survive we do.
Would you be willing to help a fellow child of Adam? I'm part of a church in a place called the Nucleus, near the town of Far Harbor. You know it?
Far Harbor? Few know of the land shrouded beneath Adam's veil, let alone claim to have worshipped within its sacred fog. An interesting assertion, if it's true. Perhaps we can help you.
Let me know if there's anything I can do to help you.
You are kind to offer, but Adam has provided us with all that we need.
Do you have a moment?
Ah, our brother from Far Harbor. What can I do for you, child?
Now she offers to help us, but we've already gotten her help. I suppose that line was meant for people who have not found Virgil's cave yet, but had already traveled to Far Harbor. I think it's great that Bethesda thought about that so that we can do Far Harbor really in any order, and the game takes that into account. It's also interesting that it seems like basking in Adam's glow is not enough for every child of Adam. Inside these little homes, we find a number of addictive substances. Cigarettes, Psycho, Mentats, even Addictol. Looks like these guys are not above getting addicted. It's from this crater that all of the radiation from all of the rad storms in the Commonwealth emanate. You can see the little sparkly bits of greenish radiation floating on up to the sky. That's what gets collected in the clouds and carried on over to the rest of the Commonwealth before it's rained down in rad storms. And as we leave the crater of Adam, those little particles disappear. Now, this wasn't the impact site for the only nuclear bomb dropped on the Commonwealth. Commonwealth? Remember, there's also the Cambridge crater and other minor impact sites in the Commonwealth. But this must be the location where multiple bombs dropped to produce such a huge crater, or where the big bomb dropped. And it's clear what their target was. Their target was likely the Sentinel site, because it posed the greatest threat to the Chinese. The bomb, in combination with the destruction of the nuclear power plant that we explored earlier, may help explain why this one location is the most highly irradiated spot in the entire Commonwealth. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the full story of the glowing sea as we find it in Fallout 4. It's one of my favorite places in the game just because it's so moody, so bleak, so inhospitable. Such a challenge even at higher levels. It's this feel that Bethesda was going for when they made Fallout 3. Those who have played Fallout 3 will remember that Fallout 3 is completely bleak. There's nothing green. There's no bright area in the entire place. It's just destruction and death. In Fallout 4, more places are blue. More places are beautiful. And that was a conscious design choice. We learned from the art of Fallout 4 that Bethesda decided to change direction from Fallout 3. They didn't want everything to be quite so bleak. They wanted to show places healing after 200 years, which is why you can find some beautiful places in Fallout 4. But the Glowing Sea is not one of them. For the Glowing Sea, they went back to their inspirations for Fallout 3. They wanted it to be bleak, hazy, toxic, irradiated, dangerous, and deadly. And I think they achieved that goal very well. Thanks for watching, everybody. What are your thoughts on the Glowing Sea? Do you enjoy it as much as I do? Let me know in the comments section below. I read all of your comments, and I use your comments as inspiration for my future videos. I make a new video 6 days a week, so be sure to subscribe and click that bell notification button to find out what I publish tomorrow. And did you know that I've got a t-shirt shop? That's right, if you're interested in wearing a Fallout or Oxhorn inspired t-shirt, you can find a link to my shop in the description below. And if you like what I do and you want to support me in a more personal way, consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon. Patreon subscribers gain access to a private channel on my Discord server, as well as a bunch of other cool Oxhorn perks. But more than anything, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just so glad you're here watching this video with me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow morning, bright and early, with a brand new video.